quite possibly the single most dramatic pro-corruption decision yet made by the Trump administration. And as you know, that's an extremely high bar. Marco Rubio fielded this legislation 6 years ago, the Corporate Transparency Act, which, in fairness to Marco Rubio, actually is a good thing. Requires corporations to list their shell companies, among other things. And the Trump administration has voided it. Let me see if I can find an article on this. Corporate Transparency Act. He's essentially legalized corruption. Here we go. From the Department of the Treasury, FinCEN permanently ends beneficial ownership reporting requirements for millions of small business owners. This might seem boring and technocratic, but one of the most popular ways for corporate corruption to take place is through the illegal hiding of money and the use of shell companies. This is how private equity works, though they often do it legally. Basically, by shuffling around who owns what and who owns debt, especially, shell companies can be used to make billions vanish or manifest out of nowhere. It's really complicated, but a full registry of what businesses are owned by which shell companies and vice versa is pretty essential to making sure the economy even somewhat functions. The other day, the Trump administration eradicated this requirement in what is pretty blatantly just an open signal that corruption is legal now. Yeah, I'm a psycho, but that ain't the reason why they're changing it. They sure love money laundering. Yeah, it's just we're kind of running out of money to launder, I feel. We're getting pretty close to the financialization of everything, you know? I don't really know how much money you can pull out of the economy more than like we're kind of like running out of surplus value to extract from the real economy. You know what I'm talking about? They're tearing planks off the hull of the ship. That's a good way of putting it, exactly. It's a very good way of putting it. Corporate Transparency Act. I misspelled transparency. How embarrassing. Any news coverage of this? No, of course not. Why would there be news coverage of this? I don't see any coverage of this at all. How do you fix financialization in the incentive structure? Is this why you're an accelerationist? Because you kind of can't? Yeah, essentially. I don't think there's any way to untwine it or untangle it, unfortunately. I'm trying to think of like a way of putting this, like what the best comparison would be. What we're living under right now would kind of be like living in an age of globalized absolute monarchy, except the absolute monarchs rule through perfect stability and control all the media and news information you receive. And also there was an elaborate sort of external layer, a kayfabe of democracy that allowed people to believe that if they had frustrations with the leadership, they could make changes, even though it doesn't actually change the outcome. Like Code Geass? I have not watched it. No spoilers. He's not watched that? No, but I plan to. It's on the watch list. No coverage of this, huh? They're pulling up more planks from the deck of the ship. NVIDIA found a new way to keep the AI boom funded. Your retirement money. Oh, fun. Well, hold on. They've been pulling from retirement money for a long time now. On Monday, NVIDIA announced partnerships with Apollo, BlackRock, Blackstone, Brookfield, Goldman Sachs, and KKR to create financing platforms intended to mobilize more than $500 billion for AI infrastructure. The money... Oh, I bet you eliminating the shell company requirements is going to come real in handy for this. The money will largely come from third-party investors, allowing NVIDIA customers to finance chips and data centers while keeping NVIDIA's own risk limited and off the balance sheet. Yep. Of what use is electoralism then? Potholes get filled, but no fewer people will die of hunger? Because Mamdani was elected in a rare but genuine moment of proletarian self-interest made manifest. And if proletarian self-interest is made manifest at a larger scale, fewer people will die of hunger because of the climate crisis. You have to remind people that there is value in getting the right people in charge. Mamdani didn't just luck out in being elected. Material circumstances had to change. He won against the former governor. There is a baseline to that, you know? There is meaning in pointing this out and participating. This is nothing new. These companies have been hiding their debt and costs off the book for a while now. Yep, and it seems like they're advancing it quite a bit. We might not even know which shell companies they're a part of. I'm pretty sure I saw a TLDR news video on this that I think might be worth visiting. I really, really hope he doesn't mind supplementing our knowledge so much in this stream.
As you probably already know, in the past couple of years, AI-adjacent companies, some of which were once flush with cash, have had to borrow absurd amounts of money to finance their AI investments. In just the first 7 months of 2026, US tech companies have already borrowed more than $300 billion, and JP Morgan expects them to issue an additional $200 billion before this year is done. This would take the total issuance to about $500 $500 billion, which would account for 20% of all debt issued in US markets this year. To put this in context, in the build-up to the dot-com bubble, tech-related debt peaked at 14% of total issuance. So this implies that AI spending is ramping up faster than in any other comparable historical episode, including the railway boom. However, it turns out this is only the tip of the iceberg, and the AI companies have been using a whole load of financial trickery to borrow trillions more off book. So in this
man, when that bubble pops, it's going to be, it's going to be rough. Yet it's not profitable. Well, profitability isn't the point. Infinite rape is the point, and they're getting what they want.
Video, we're going to explain how these companies are able to effectively hide trillions of dollars of debt, and what risks this might present for the sector as a whole. Is better. Canada or Bloomberg published at about the same time, which found that Oracle were hiding an additional $1.65 trillion in off-the-book debts, more than the roughly $1.35 trillion of debt that they've explicitly admitted to on their balance sheets. This was all confirmed by another investigation by Bloomberg published at about the same time, which found that, like its fellow tech giants, Nvidia also had more off than on-book debt. Now, you might
look at that. So for all the debt we've covered from these companies, it's actually like more than double what is reported on.
I assume that shady financing is the norm among big US corporations. But while there always has been a bit of it going on, the volume of hidden debt has ballooned over the past couple of years. And unsurprisingly,
I think this is why AI might be a problem in the long term, such that it might actually stick around. It represents basically infinite capacity for rent seeking. Well, this is the reason why the capital elites are trying to quickly find a replacement for democracy, you know? It's why the United Kingdom, the EU, and America are all so invested in every possible technological means of suppressing democracy. It's because they understand there's not really any other way to keep this supported. The problem is, I don't think it's going to work. You know, installing flock cameras might help you arrest the occasional Antifa agitator, but it's not going to do anything when 200 million Americans suddenly realize that there's no food at their local grocery store, right? It's not like, in a historical context, if the future has any historians left to revisit this period and reflect on it, this is going to be seen as meaningless. You know, if anything, the flock cameras are a bad strategic decision because all they're really doing is fomenting class resentment. The AI data centers are just making people angry at them right now, you know? There's no way they're going to be able to keep this shit afloat when the grid starts failing.
Much of this increase can be attributed to AI-related costs. There are two main methods by which these companies have been able to, quote-unquote, hide this debt. The first is via what are known as long-term purchase agreements, which are basically when, instead of borrowing money in order to buy something, you commit to buying something in the future. This still creates a debt-like liability. After all, you now owe someone money in the future, but you don't have to chalk it down as a loan on your balance sheet. In the context of the AI boom/bubble, these long-term purchase agreements are mainly used for—
Money didn't feel fake when it was tied to a golden nugget. I'm very sorry, but the gold standard was just as fake as the economy is now. Rent-seeking, speculation, financialization, and inflation all happened there too. There's not really any meaningful difference between saying the value of a dollar is backed by some amount of gold versus saying that the value of a dollar is backed by trust in the US government. There's no reason to like direct it against fiat currencies or whatever. An abstract representation of value turned into a unit of currency is always going to be to some extent or another arbitrary. I mean, after all, even if we didn't have currency at all and just used gold, that would just make the gold a currency, right? An exchangeable, fungible, you know, divisible source of value that you can use to exchange for goods and services. And even then, the value of gold is only really tied to the material means of preserving your ownership over it. To put it another way, your gold is worth nothing to you if you're dead, right? The value of currency is kind of predicated on law. If you don't have a law and anyone can just take anything, what's the value of currency? A person could just make you do anything. If you held any amount of a currency, they could just take it from you. Thus, contract law and the trust in government is a necessary component of the functioning of a currency, even if it's backed by gold.
chips, with lots of AI companies committing to buying some very expensive high-end chips in the future. Nvidia, for instance, has $119 billion in binding, non-cancelable future purchase obligations, primarily with manufacturing partners.
I think a good way of understanding this is that right now in today's world, if you suddenly realize that you in your house have like $1 billion in gold stashed, like there's a big gold pile in your house that you own that technically becomes yours, in today's world, that would suddenly make you very, very wealthy. It's your gold. But in a lawless world, it would just make you a target. You would not meaningfully have that money because you aren't able to defend it. Any vagabond or highwayman could just come in and kill you, and then it's theirs. And then someone could kill them, and then it's theirs, etc., etc. You become a Fortnite loot box all over again, which is exactly the point that I've made about doomsday preppers, right? They just become loot boxes in the end. Doesn't really fix anything. You can hoard as much as you want. It doesn't change the underlying social fabric that is the reason you're able to preserve those holdings.
Like TSMC, for bespoke production capacity for Nvidia's own chips. The second, and slightly scarier method, is via what are known as lease agreements, which are basically when a company agrees to rent something for a fixed period of time. Under US accounting laws, public companies only have to report each rent payment as a cash outflow, not the total amount that they've committed to spend over the course of the lease. For instance, imagine I want to build a data center that costs $10 billion, and I need to borrow money to afford it. I could just borrow the money and build it, but that would require me to take out a big loan, which, if I'm a public company, I would have to report on my next quarterly earnings. So instead, I might get another company to basically build the data center for me, even if they'll probably have to take out
It's all shell companies, see? Likely the reason the Treasury is disbanding the shell company disclosure requirement is to assist in this, the hyper-growth of the AI bubble.
Loan themselves, and then enter a long-term lease agreement with said company to pay them the $10 billion and probably a bit extra to compensate them for the risk in quarterly installments over the next 10 years. In this scenario, I would still effectively owe this company at least $10 billion, but I wouldn't have to admit it in my reports. I would only have to admit that I spent $250 million this quarter as part of the lease agreement, which obviously sounds a lot better than I borrowed $10 billion for another big data center. Big AI companies also offer what are known as credit backstops to these intermediary companies. In other words, they promise them that if the intermediary company runs out of money or is unable to borrow more, they'll step in to cover them.
This is all like, it does kind of feel like we're speed running towards default territory, unfortunately.
And this creates
Default,
a liability, but one that you don't have to admit on your balance sheet. These lease agreements have become increasingly popular in recent years. Oracle, for instance, has an eye-watering $260 billion of future lease commitments that will eventually land on its books, which is a lot of hidden debt for a company with $67 billion in annual revenue, and was one of the big reasons that its credit rating was downgraded earlier this month. Anyway, you get the idea. These big AI companies are increasingly relying on slightly dodgy off-book techniques to finance their investments. Growing awareness of all of this might explain why their borrowing costs are apparently on the up. This is
what specifically would happen if we default in our debt? End of the world.
Why? And it's
what specifically? A very large number of very bad things, too extensive for me to detail, and too, I guess, complex for any one person to fully keep track of.
Upcoming funding round for a new 1 gigawatt data center project in Texas, which Meta is essentially financing via the sort of lease agreement we described a second ago. Meta and its intermediaries have had to offer yields of up to 7.5% to find creditors, up from the 7.1% they had to offer only 9 months ago to find funding for their Hyperion data center in Manhattan. Similarly, this might also explain why the cost of insuring 5-year bonds issued by big AI companies has spiked in the past couple of days.
That's not great. All of this is very like bubble hyperinflating before it pops.
Oracle looks particularly shaky here, with credit default swaps on Oracle jumping to 2.12% last week, which means that it costs $212,000 a year to insure $10 million of Oracle bonds against default. Now, as a final thing, it's worth stressing that not all AI companies are equally dependent on dodgy debt, or equally exposed to any increase in AI-related borrowing costs. Companies like Alphabet and Meta, which are proven moneymakers with diversified revenue streams, are obviously less exposed than companies like Oracle, which are more aggressively leveraged and more singularly dependent on AI-related revenues. However, while they're hard to actually measure quantitatively, there are clearly lots of so-called contagion risks.
Yeah. What's default territory? Nobody knows. Let it pop before election day? It's not going to be that fast, probably. Wish we chipped away at that deficit? Was never going to happen. Speaking of the deficit, by the way, man, oh man, is that ballooned. The US government officially posts its largest July budget deficit in history at minus $432 billion due to an acceleration in federal spending. Interest on US debt rose plus $26 billion from last July's levels to an alarming $118 billion for the month. In 1 year, our interest payments have risen by over 25%. It's an exponential rate of growth. This puts total interest expense for the fiscal year 2026 up to $1.17 trillion. As a result, interest spending on our debt has officially surpassed both national defense and Medicare spending. And the interest rates are probably going to go up in the future in order to combat inflation. Also, Japan's highly reliant on U.S. trade in the U.S. dollar. If the U.S. dollar collapses, Japan would probably default too. Oh, the whole world would. I don't know why I expect the government to be better with money than me. Well, you're bad with money because you lack discipline. The government is bad with money because the government is complete regulatory capture of our institutions means that the government basically only exists to transfer wealth upwards. They're succeeding in the one measure they're attempting to succeed, which isn't great. It's nice they keep letting Ed Zitron on the CNBC rather than having, like, I don't know, killed him or whatever they actually want to do.
NVIDIA's latest AI financing initiative with Wall Street heavyweights and Jensen Huang's subsequent attempts to alleviate concerns over circular financing. Our next guest says the new initiative is vendor financing by proxy. Ed Zitron is the CEO of Easy Primary Research and host of the Better Offline podcast. Ed, good to see you.
Good to be here.
So you don't think this alleviates the concerns about circular financing?
No, this fund, which is, by the way, still a memorandum of understanding, we do not actually have contracts, it's just vendor financing. NVIDIA is raising the funding, they're finding the customers, they're the vendor, they're the customer in some cases with CoreWeave, they're a large customer with Lambda. They basically pay people to rent back the GPUs that they sell them. They help raise the debt. They find the sites. It's vendor finance.
He looks haunted. If you knew what was coming, you would feel haunted too. It's a miracle I still look as youthful and you know, attentive that I do.
Financing, but they've been smarter than the Ciscos and the Lucents in the past by not actually becoming a bank.
Well, and I think that's an important part in that the financiers that they're working with are the ones who are going to determine what the interest rate is that they lend on, as opposed to NVIDIA removing itself from that process, which creates more of a, you know, traditional kind of lender-borrower dynamic, and such that, you know, we will lend to you, but here's the price by which it will cost for you to actually borrow this money.
But the trick that NVIDIA does is they lend their credit to companies by not actually lending their credit. With Lambda and CoreWeave, I think they pay them $1.3 billion or more in these 4-year-long contracts. These contracts are then taken to financiers, and they say, hey, look, we have a customer. Even though that customer is also the vendor, NVIDIA also propped up CoreWeave's IPO. They invested over $2 billion in them, and I think in Iron as well, post-IPO. They are propping up...
Sorry, this might be a little bit technical for some people. Sorry, that was very condescending the way I phrased it. I can chip in partially to blame here. My mind is wandering a little bit. This is important stuff though. We'll revisit the subject soon.